Well, welcome to another bonus edition of Planet Possible. I'm delighted to be joined today by Gillian Blythe. Gillian's the CEO of Water New Zealand. Welcome, Gillian.
Thank you.
And Terry Fuller, a familiar voice to many listeners. Terry is the Chief Executive of Cywin.
Hello.
Hello, lovely to see you both. So we're all here together in the UK and we thought we'd take the opportunity to record a special bonus edition of Planet Possible for you. We wanted to talk about something that's really significant that's happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand at the moment and over the coming 12 months or so, which is water reform. So, Gillian, just give us a bit of a feel for what is water reform?
There's a number of elements to it. So back in 2016, there was a contamination event in Havelock North where unfortunately about 5,000 people got sick and a number of people died. And that really focused the attention on making sure that our drinking water is safe. And so one of the things that has occurred is that we have established a new regulator, Te Mata Arawai, which is responsible for regulating drinking water. They will also have various responsibilities for wastewater and stormwater. So that's one element. A second element is that unlike the UK, where you've got large entities providing water services to communities, we've got 67 councils across the country. New Zealand is 5 million people. Mm-hmm. So you've got 67 councils that are providing drinking water, wastewater and stormwater services to the public. And so the plan is to bring those together into 4 entities. We haven't got as far as naming them. They are currently entity A, B, C and D.
It's catchy.
It's catchy. And we're going through the legislative process for that. I was at Select Committee just before I came away, and so there's a piece of legislation that's got to be passed that will then allow those establishment units to be created, and the plan is that it will have drinking water, wastewater and stormwater responsibilities. It is a huge change.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is that over the years, we've seen that because councils have naturally budgets to manage, haven't been able to spend enough on water services. And so one of the pieces that we're saying is that the infrastructure deficit that's at least been estimated is something like $120 to $185 billion needs to be spent over the next 30 years. Now, in the UK context, that may not sound, it sounds like a big number because we're talking billions,
yep.
But that's effectively, a double, possibly treble or even a quadrupling every single year for 30 years.
Wow.
That's huge.
Yeah, and that's water, wastewater, stormwater,
Yes.
The whole lot. Good grief. So I know from a previous episode of Planet Possible, we talked about something that I thought was fascinating, Te Mana o Te Wai. So tell us a little bit more about what that is and how that fits into water reform.
Te Mana o Te Wai is something that's come from our resource management legislation. There was a national policy statement written on freshwater management back in 2017 and revised in 2020. And the concept is to create a hierarchy of obligations. So the first is the obligation is to the health and the well-being of the water body and the ecosystems. The second is to the health needs of people, so drinking water. And then the third is the ability of people and communities to provide for their social, economic and cultural well-being. We talk about wanting to protect and to enhance the mauri, so the life force of water.
And that will be written into, I guess, legislation that accompanies water reform.
Absolutely. So it's already in the legislation that established Te Mata Arawai. Mm-hmm. The legislation basically says if you have a power, a function or a duty under that act, you have to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai. And so what that has meant is that under the structure of the regulator, there is a board, but there is also a Maori advisory group, the Maori Ropu, and the way it works, there are some common members of the board and the Maori Ropu. If there is recommendations from the Maori group to the board has to consider those. But if they were not to take them into account, they need to respond in an annual report that's tabled with Parliament and explain why they are not taking those recommendations into account.
Terry, I want to just come to you and hear your reflections on what you're hearing from Gillian and that approach, really. Obviously, you've spent a lot of your career working in the kind of UK context for water and environmental management. So what do you think?
It is fascinating. I would use that word, but also it just fills me with hope as well, actually, hearing that. It's something, I can't find the right word yet. It's deeper than fascinating. It's hopeful. And the reason I say that is because if you look around the world, actually, the most significant partner in any water governance system is actually the public. Whether you call them a customer, a consumer, it is the public, the most significant partner. So they're not just a body of people that we're supplying water to. They absolutely are a partner in making all of this work, particularly as we have to be more responsible about the way we treat and manage water going forward. So to be grounding your new governance structures and your new approach in an understanding of the public, and in this case in particular an Indigenous people, I think is really exciting. And I mean, just hearing little bits that we've talked about earlier today, Gillian, about how grounded the Maori belief systems are in nature, and the guidance that gives actually in terms of responsible management of water and our environment, I think it's tremendous. And it really puts me in mind actually of my experiences at COP26, whereby it was quite clear throughout COP26 that there was this recognition of the need to listen to the Indigenous population in countries all around the world. The narrative has moved on from being one of we ought to listen to Indigenous people. There's almost out of respect we ought to actually a realisation that that's where a lot of the answers are going to lie. So it's not that we ought to, we absolutely need to. And there was a groundswell, I thought, at COP of recognition that Indigenous populations all around the world are able to provide guidance and a fresh thinking and approach which we've just not been able to find using our traditional methods and by dipping into the traditional pool of people that we normally go to for ideas. So I find it really hopeful.
I agree. I mean, I think talking with our members, there is a real desire to understand and to think about what we can do to promote, a sustainable management of the water environment. And I think the Te Mana o Te Wai framework is going to enable a deeper conversation than perhaps has happened previously.
And I think in relation to that, Gillian, you were talking earlier as well about the level of awareness that the public in New Zealand have about water. Just taking UK experience, we find a real lack of awareness of water in terms of how it gets around, how it gets out of your tap, what happens when you flush the toilet, etc., which is a real problem. We have to raise that awareness. But it seemed to me it's even more buried within New Zealand because of the way it's provided through the local authorities and the fact it's just an element of a much bigger bill. It isn't even a bill in its own right. So I think you've particularly got a bit of a mountain to climb there.
I think we do. In Auckland, it's slightly different because Watercare is a council-controlled organisation and does send a direct bill. But in Wellington, technically, I get my water from Wellington Water, but Wellington Water, the revenue that it gets from me paying my bill is via the council. Unless I delve into the details of those many emails you get from different people, I wouldn't have that information. And it was only recently that I looked and I happened, because I'm now sufficiently interested in water to do this sort of thing, I've actually go and, there was a breakdown for every $1, how much is spent. And I think when I looked at the stormwater, the wastewater and the drinking water, it was about 35 cents of my 100 cents is spent on water.
Which is actually strikes me as quite a significant proportion, actually, and therefore it ought to be more important and higher profile.
And I think the other bit is that, in Wellington, we don't have meters. And again, different parts of the country, there are meters. The conversations you might have with your family about, is that a 3-minute shower or a 10-minute shower?
Yeah.
And I mean, certainly in terms of, for Māori, water is a treasure, it's a tonga. And so the whole conversation about, are we looking after it, both in terms of, at one level, the consumption of water in the household, and in terms of whether it's an appropriate quantity. There's obviously an investment required, that if we all used lots of water, then there is the need for new sources of water, whether it's groundwater or new reservoirs, and then there is consequences with all of that. And certainly in terms of Water New Zealand runs a national benchmarking, has done for a number of years. So in terms of New Zealand, the amount of water that is lost between source and the tap, on average, is about 20%. But for some districts, for a variety of reasons, it's as high as 50%. There will be many reasons behind that. Some of that will be because, in different parts of the country have had earthquakes, or they just haven't been able to spend what you need to on renewals. But when you start to focus people's minds on water is a treasure, then you start to have, I think, a different conversation with the consumer, with the user of water.
Does it feel like you can tell stories using Te Mana o Te Wai in a way that perhaps are harder to do when we talk here in the UK about the water cycle? You know, it's one of the first things that you can probably remember learning when you're at primary school, isn't it, is the water cycle. Is Te Mana o Te Wai used as a device to help people connect with water?
I think it will be. One of the pieces, and I'm very conscious that I'm speaking as a UK citizen. I'm also a dual citizen in terms of New Zealand. So I wasn't brought up in New Zealand and I'm not Maori. But in terms of some of the stories that are passed down, and recognising the stories are different depending on which part of the country you're in. But in terms of one of the stories is in terms of Ranginui, the Sky Father, and Papa Tanuku, the Earth Mother, in terms of when they were separated, the sadness from being separated. Tears is the rain. The tears of Earth Mother form the rivers, the streams, the lakes. And one of the pieces that I think is really helpful in terms of some of the stories, the kidneys of Earth Mother are wetlands. Your kidneys clearly cleanse your blood. Wetlands help to cleanse and restore the mauri, the life force of water. And I think those sorts of conversations can be a really helpful way of highlighting what happens and what needs to happen in the water cycle.
So Terry, if I come to you thinking about what Gillian's just described, I mean, is something like that ever possible, do you think, in the UK context, that degree of storytelling? Obviously, not specifically what we've just talked about, because that's very specific to Aotearoa, to New Zealand. But can you imagine people connecting with water in that kind of way in the UK?
Well, we are a nation of storytellers. I mean, we have folklores and all sorts of storytelling history. We've probably lost our way a little bit on that in recent generations, but we have that heritage. So I'd like to think so. It's not my area of expertise, but we have to find a way of doing that, though. There is a lack of connectivity, emotional connectivity, I think, between a lot of people in the general public and the way we manage water and our environment. And I think listening to Gillian's story, that moves me, you know, that really connects me at an emotional level. And we have to find the ways of telling that stories to illustrate this idea that the consumers of water, which of course is all of us, are a partner, a part of a partnership. We're not just there to receive and take for granted what we get. So yes, we need to find the ways of telling the stories, or imagery using art and music, etc.
I know in talking with various people from around New Zealand, older generations might talk about how they collected certain types of fish, watercress, whitebait, and some of those, the ability to be able to do some of that collection has been lost because the water environment has degraded. Okay. And I think when you talk in those sorts of ways, you can imagine being in a part of Derbyshire and having a conversation about, was there I want to say a freshwater cray, but whatever we would have actually had, I've sort of, spent too long away. But in terms of being able to say, what were you able to do 3-4 decades ago and collect some of those oral histories, I think is a really important way of being able to do it.
Yeah, that's a good angle, isn't it? Because, it is about change prompts people to tell stories, doesn't it? Particularly sort of reminiscing about the way things were and how they're different now. It's that change and trends over time which can be really powerful illustrators of why we are where we are at the moment and what the challenges are going forward. So, yeah, I guess the answer to your question, Nikki, is that we, and perhaps SciWem, has a part in this. Really, is to find those people that have a perspective, interact with water in various different ways, and get them to tell their stories. And our role is to be the conduit for those stories, whether it's through podcasts or photographic competitions or any other manner of things that we could do.
And I think one of the critical pieces is that Te Mana o Te Wai is very place-based. What it means to somebody in Auckland will be different to what it means to someone in Kaikoura or in Gore. And so it's about how do you collect those stories from around the country, because the receiving environment will have different capacity to cope with whatever's happening, in that environment. And I think the multiple stories is quite important.
It's really interesting that, we talk about catchment management a little bit, and it's kind of that in action, isn't it? But coming from a completely different perspective. And there's a lot of news at the moment about the quality of chalk streams, for example, which is a very precious and specific habitat that we have a huge amount of them here in the UK in comparison to the rest of the world, but they're still very rare, and that's not the same as other rivers or other water environments. So it's very interesting thinking about if you like, the oral history of, in a place-based way, related to water. That's not something I've ever really considered before, but it's fascinating. If I can turn us to something a little more practical, maybe just to conclude. So, I mean, it sounds wonderful. Terry and I are clearly captivated. Are there any risks that you're perceiving at this early stage with Te Mana Wai being so integral to water reform?
I think there is a thirst for information. There will be a real role for Mātauranga Māori practitioners, people who can reflect what Te Mana Wai means to the iwi or the hapu, the sub-tribe, in a particular region. We will need to be able to support them to be able to articulate what it means. And certainly when you look at the number of roles that will be required, I mean, I've seen figures that, might talk about 6,000 Mātauranga Māori practitioners being required across different government, different, governance arrangements across the environmental reforms and the water reforms. Now, that's an awful lot of people.
Yeah.
And they don't exist in those roles at the moment. But there is also going to be a need for organisations that are working in water to increase their understanding of Māori worldviews. There is a real need to increase and support everyone to increase their understanding of Te Māori, the Māori worldview.
Well, when does water reform happen? Feels like that's coming in the next 12 to 18 months,
so,
is that right?
The plan is that the changeover date will be 1 July 2024.
Okay.
We've got a number of hurdles to get through. We've got the Water Service Entities Bill is before the House at the moment, or before Select Committee. I think the report back is the 11th of November this year. We would hope that piece of legislation will be passed before Christmas. But then there needs to be a second piece of legislation which will then ultimately say what these organisations, what their specific assets are. There's a lot more definitions work that needs to go in. That will be, I imagine, introduced early next year. We're also expecting a third piece of legislation around the establishment of an economic regulator.
Right. Wow.
Which is a really new concept for the water sector. We've never had it. The Commerce Commission, which is our competition authority, does economic regulation for gas, electricity, telecoms, airports. We haven't had a decision at this stage in terms of whether they will be that party that will do the economic regulation. But one of the pieces that certainly Water New Zealand has been saying to the officials that are drafting the policy is you need to make sure that the concept of Te Mana Wai, because it's in the regulation for Te Mata Arawai and will be in the water services legislation, must be part of the economic regulatory regime. Because otherwise you can imagine having a conversation about I need to spend this much on a water treatment plant, and that's going to give effect to Te Mana Wai, and let's just throw some numbers, $20 million. But the economic regulator says, but I don't have that, I'm only giving you 15 million.
Yeah.
And so you need to make sure that you've got a level playing field of expectation management.
I hope you'll come back at some point and join us on Planet Possible, and we can find out a little bit more about water reform as it progresses, Gillian.
Be very keen to. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
An absolute delight. So all it leaves me to say is a massive thank you to Gillian and to Terry, and join us again soon for another episode of Planet Possible. That's it for now. Stay safe, everyone.